All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're moving on to Commander Staff College briefers now. So Major Travis Chamberlin is going to spend a few minutes talking to us about a hot topic right now, which is obviously Force Design 2030. It's been a topic for the last few years, but given the retired community, they are really making it hot right now. So welcome.
Okay, thanks, sir. I appreciate it. As said, Major Travis Chamberlin, a student at Command and Staff College, and I wrote my Master of Military Studies thesis on organizational change, specifically on Force Design 2030. Okay, so busy slide, but I'll spend the next few minutes talking through this. So I'll start with a little bit of background on kind of how I arrived at talking about this topic. I'll talk through some literature that I did some research on, and then go into some case studies and finally some conclusions about Force Design 2030. So as you can see across the top was really my research question that got me started thinking about this, which was how does the Marine Corps quickly and effectively implement Force Design 2030 changes, but really how do we set the foundation for long-term proficiency in organizational change? So Force Design 2030 is a really ambitious undertaking. There's a lot going on with it. But this isn't the first time we've had major transformation efforts. And you can see in the gray boxes on the slide, just in my 13 years in the Marine Corps, I've seen the Marine Corps Vision and Strategy 2025 under General Conway. And then I can recall when Expeditionary Force 21 came out under General Amos. And so when you think of it in those terms, we're a learning organization. So this is just one more milestone in a constant evolution of our organization. So as I was thinking through this, I decided that, hey, I'm going to go back and see what anyone else has said about Force Design 2030. How have we started this previously? So I went to one of last year's students, Major Kenneth Conover. He had approached this same topic and really looked at some infantry-specific solutions. But I wanted to look more largely across the entire force and kind of figure out how can we do organizational change better. So if you look toward the bottom of the screen, there are two different models. In the bottom left, you see a model from Dr. Andrew Pettigrew from Oxford, and he looks at organizational change in terms of context, content, and process. So he really looks at what is the environment in which this change is happening, the content being what are we actually changing, and with force design, as we mentioned, there's a ton, but really what interested me the most was the process. How do we implement these changes and make sure that they permeate the force effectively? So if you go to the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that's another model that further builds on that, and that's by Dr. Andrew Van de Ven and Dr. Marshall Poole. And they really categorize organizational change process in 4 categories based on kind of 2 variables. The unit of change, whether this is happening at a small individual entity or it's happening across an entire organization with lots of subordinate elements, like the Marine Corps, right? And they also, the other variable they look at is the mode of change, whether this is a prescribed change, like we very much understand the outcome that we're trying to achieve, or whether it's novel. We don't know exactly what's going to be the outcome in the end. And the 2 that I'll draw your attention to are evolutionary and teleological change processes. Evolutionary being, this is happening across multiple entities, but it's very prescribed. It can be thought of as directive, where the organization kind of adopts the best practices along the way. Teleological is at the individual element level, novel solutions to problems that we encounter along the way. It is a very constructive idea, right? So with that in mind, I kind of addressed 2 different case studies. I looked at previous change efforts that we had done in the Marine Corps to see if I could draw some lessons learned from that, essentially. So the first was the adoption of the maneuver warfare philosophy back in the 1980s. So that was a very grassroots initiative, the way it started. It was focused here at AWS under Colonel Michael Wiley, who had some free thinkers who were kind of talking about some maneuver warfare philosophy, some tenets. It was in 2nd Marine Division under General Al Gray, who they published the maneuver warfare handbook and kind of drove how he did his exercises in 2nd Marine Division. You also had Colonel John Boyd, who was doing the OODA loop thing at the time, as well as Bill Lind, who was a congressional staffer who was doing some study on the 1973 October War, really looking at how maneuver warfare was involved there. It wasn't until General Gray became commandant that he could take those disparate elements and coalesce them into what became FMFM1 warfighting, now MCDP1. So you see this trend from this decentralized grassroots, what we would call teleological development, bringing that into an evolutionary mindset kind of at the headquarters level. The second case study that I looked at was the transition from conventional military operations to counterinsurgency in Iraq in the 2003-2005 timeframe. That was driven primarily by TTPs developing in theater in response to a changing security environment, right? So as the insurgency bloomed, individual unit commanders, primarily from 1MEF, who was there in 2003 and then again in 2004, individual unit commanders developing TTPs based on best practices of how their individual battle spaces were developing, right? Those TTPs were then fed back into the headquarters, primarily Training and Education Command, so that we could build counterinsurgency proficiency across the force. That wasn't something we had done for a while since, say, Vietnam, right? So that came back into Training and Education Command, where we developed Mojave Viper from the CACs in 29 Palms under TTCG. That fed into what was going on here at MCU with Colonel John Toulon, who had been an RCT-1 commander in theater, brought those lessons back and shaped the command and staff curriculum. So again, this move from a decentralized individual units developing proficiency, developing capability, and then coalescing those efforts into a much more evolutionary approach, I guess, to counterinsurgency is what you would say. So this trend toward a centralization. Fast forward to Force Design 2030, it's quite the opposite, right? So the initial take from Force Design 2030 came down in a very directive manner from Headquarters Marine Corps through the Commandant's Planning Guidance, through the publishing of Force Design 2030, and some of the other concepts that that's made to support. So it's been directive. It was relatively close hold. Right now, CD&I is tasked with running Force Design 2030 efforts. And to do so, they've set up a number of IPTs, kind of by functional area, right? So the combat arms guys are doing some force design stuff, logistics and so forth. And these IPTs are a little bit separate, but broadly speaking, it's still a relatively centralized effort. The Commandant then directs that kind of the next phase of this is really experimentation and exercise. Eventually, we're going to have to take these ideas that have been brought about by CD&I and put those into practice at the individual small unit level and figure out how we're going to employ under some of these new concepts. Like EABO, as I use in my title, is just one example of that. So we're going to have to move toward this more decentralized effort where you will have battalions from maybe 1MEF, battalions from 3MEF, independently creating solutions to the novel problems that they're going to encounter. When we try to figure out, when we put Marines on an island in the Pacific, how are they going to do their business with a new structure, with a new equipment set, under new operating constraints, figuring out how we're going to employ the force. Those are all going to be new challenges. My fear is that since we've moved from this centralized to decentralized form of organizational change, do we have the right structures in place to generate the feedback and coalesce all of those findings back at the service headquarters? Because all of those things that we're going to be doing at these disparate elements need to inform doctrinal changes, need to inform acquisitions programs, need to inform further force design efforts. Some of the things that I think about are past experiences I've had in ways that organizations have bridged what I refer to as those organizational striations, right? So think all of the various DCs, there are striations between those, or from the operating forces level up to the headquarters. So there's these divisions in our organization. We need to find ways to bridge those. I think back on my time at NATO, which is where I was at before I came to Command and Staff. I worked in a J5 shop. I was the amphibious planner. If I had any question about a specific capability or an exercise that was going to involve NATO amphibious forces, I didn't have to go to one of the 30 nations and talk to them specifically. I went to an organization called CJOS COE, which was the Combined Joint Operations from the Sea Center of Excellence. And they work under NATO and they handle anything related to amphibious capability for NATO, whether it be exercises, policy, equipment sets, capability, whatever that is. So I could go straight to that organization and say, hey, we really need to exercise this specific capability. What's going on in the exercise program, or who has forces available? That center of excellence maintained a pulse on everything that was going on with respect to amphibious capability across NATO. So when I think of all of the various things that are going to be happening with respect to experimentation and training for Force Design 2030, like EABO, it may make sense to establish an organization that can keep the pulse on what's going on and make sure that those lessons we're learning from those individual battalions who are generating those novel solutions, making sure that those can get fed back into the right places at the service headquarters. And we would funnel those through this center of excellence who can make sure that it's communicated accurately to the respective DCs to inform decision making. I understand that Force Design 2030 is happening in a budget constrained environment. We all know that. So generating a new headquarters called, EABO Center of Excellence may not be ideal, right? I thought back then to what are some other methods I've seen happen successfully in our Marine Corps. I used to attend what was called the Sea Basing OAG. I taught the MPF staff planning course, and I wanted to know what was going on so that I could teach it in my course, the latest in terms of doctrine, in terms of exercises that were ongoing, in terms of what was happening with the MPF program in an acquisitions respect and all those things. The OAG provided a forum for the entire community of interest to come together and be very much aware of what was going on. It was ran by PP&O. There were representatives from across the DCs who attended, across the MARFORs and MEFs, the schoolhouse, and all of those individuals could come together and share that information. That may be another option to make sure that as we transition into a period of experimentation and exercises, that may be a useful forum to make sure that the right lessons learned are being received back up at the headquarters so that they can inform the iterative process of Force Design 2030. So as we move forward for some additional considerations, we have to understand that the Marine Corps is not the only organization who's undergoing major transformation efforts right now. The rest of the Joint Force is doing the exact same thing. I think it's really important that the Joint Force understands how they plug into what the Marine Corps is doing, and vice versa. We plug into the Joint Force and understand what that give and take relationship is going to look like when we start to employ forces in the Pacific, right? The two models that I've talked about, maybe the Center of Excellence model, maybe the OAG model, those may be the type of conduit we need to make sure that information is flowing accordingly. It would be really easy for another member of the Joint Force to plug into, for example, the Marine Corps EABO Center of Excellence, so that they understand exactly where we're at with respect to developing that doctrine accordingly, new acquisitions programs, exercise schedules that's ongoing, and so forth, so that we can make sure that we're tied in with what the rest of the Joint Force is doing. So those are some thoughts. In closing, I'll just say that the focus of my research was less on the content of Force Design 2030. There's a lot of stuff changing. What I'm concerned with is how are we doing it? Are we approaching this change in an effective manner? Because as I said in the beginning, Force Design 2030 is just another milestone. When 2030 arrives, the environment is going to have changed and we're going to have the next initiative on the horizon. I think it's really important that we look at not only what are we trying to change in our force, but how are we approaching change to make sure that we are building that foundation of long-term proficiency. So that being said, that's what I have to say.
That is great, actually. First question I have is, did you explore any other OAG environments or structures? Because I have my own experiences in the intel community, and we had waxing and waning participation, right, from the various equities and the various intelligence disciplines. So some communities were very good about sharing the lessons that they learned in other theaters, and then making that up to headquarters Marine Corps or to the entities that actually could apply that to updating doctrine and policy. Some not so much.
Right.
And then theoretically, that all fed into different levels. So the executive steering group, which then fed the OAG itself and the director of intelligence for actual decisions in headquarters Marine Corps. And then that was shifted, I think, into DCI to try and do something similar, but with the entire information community. Did you see any other communities that were able to do that successfully or not as successful?
So I didn't dig into that in great detail. Most of my experience had been at the sea basing OAG, which was a fantastic program that those two, it was really led by PP&O and the folks from CD&I who were under, it used to be called MEXWID, I think, Maritime Expeditionary Warfare Integration Division or something. But they did a fantastic job at making sure the right folks were in the room. I know there was varying success to the OAG model. Some of them maybe not so useful. And I think that is probably why we've kind of gone away from most of that, because there are a few OAGs that still exist. It's really been a kind of gone by the wayside now for some different planning or community-based interests, right? So I didn't dig into great detail about which ones were kind of good or not good. I just look back on my experience at the sea basing OAG, and it was an incredibly effective event. And as a schoolhouse, I was the person who was going to be, we were the sole trainers of what was going on in MPF.
Nice. And
I was invited to speak annually. I mean, we could go in and talk about the latest things that were going on in our curriculum. And it was just a really inclusive environment where they wanted to get the right people in the room. That may not have been the case at all of the OAGs.
But I think to the point, right, having good leadership,
exactly,
like to build the right environment that can make those things extremely effective. Absolutely great. So great recommendations. I like that. So where to next, and how are you going to continue following this?
So when I graduate, I'll be heading to CLB7 to go be the XO. So I'll be right in the heart of where a lot of our training is going on out at under TTCG with all the major exercises that are going on.
I was going to say, so that experimentation.
Great environment to be in.
Yeah, that'll be exciting. And then, as we were talking before, not only your access to the NWXs, the SLE, the service level training programs, but also the existing centers of excellence, right? So Marine Corps Tactics and Operations Group and Logistics Operations Group, and somewhat close proximity to MOTS out there.
Yes, sir.
Although a little bit more hidden in the desert. So I hope you continue, because I think some of the lessons and recommendations you have make a lot of sense, and we should try and use them.
Great, thanks, sir.
Okay. Last call for any questions. Sir?
In here. Chamberlin, could you talk to us a little bit more about your models? Why you actually selected those models? Because we spent quite a bit of time looking at models of organization change, and at Command Staff College, we rely heavily on Cotter. Of course, you embrace other models. I just want to hear a little bit more about that. The kind of thinking, how your thinking changed as you work through these different models.
Yes, sir. So in doing some of the research to go back to some of the most popular literature on organizational change, Cotter is one that it's probably the most popular in terms of in academia and in the business sector, right? The problem with Cotter's model is that it tends to just be a life cycle change. It's when it's kind of an 8-step approach. It's kind of checklisty, and it tends to be a little bit too simplified. The reason I looked at Pettigrew's model and subsequently Van de Ven and Poole's model is that they account for some of the additional complexity in approaching organizational change. I talked about the striations kind of in an organization. That's specifically true in military organizations because there are very different priorities at the tactical level, the operational level, and then up at the service headquarters.
And in between the different communities.
Exactly, and across the various communities. So trying to find a way to approach organizational change in such a complex environment can be really difficult. And Pettigrew and the other model tend to appreciate those complexities a little more. And it really gets at some of the environmental factors that it can either hinder or accelerate change. So that's really kind of why I went with those two, and really digging into the process element itself, right? Good. Getting into the teleological at the lower level versus evolutionary really at the headquarters level. So
good, sir. Well, thank you very much, Travis. I appreciate you coming here and a very interesting topic and your conclusions and recommendations. I like this.
Great. Thanks, sir.
Thanks.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.